Thank you for that very kind introduction. Can you hear me? Good? Loud and clear? I thought for a moment that bending down I could come up with a puppet or something, but in light of our topic tonight, it'd be nice to start on a light note, but no puppets in the house. But it is great to be with you guys, and a heartfelt thank you to our chaplain and the office of the chaplaincy and to the administration for inviting me. And thank you guys for being here. I know you guys, well, some of you have to be here, I guess. Who has to? No, don't raise your hand. You could be elsewhere, but you're here, and I am grateful, and I offer greetings from Fuller Theological Seminary, where I teach full-time. And I've loved being on your campus today. It's beautiful in so many different ways, not just the architecture, but the landscape. And personally, as somebody who started mowing lawns when he was 13, I have to say I fell in love with all those green lawns. I just thought, I want to mow them. So maybe next time you can invite me to mow your lawns, because that would make me very happy. All right, faith in the arts, anger, violence, and the Psalms. On August 1st, 1966, in Austin, Texas, Charles Whitman murdered his mother and his wife before climbing the University of Texas Tower. He killed 14 people and wounded 31. On August 20th, 1999, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold entered Columbine High School, Littleton, Colorado, with 4 guns and pipe bombs. They killed 13 people and wounded 24. On April 16th, 2007, Seung-Hui Cho, an English major, entered the campus of Virginia Tech and opened fire. He killed 32 people and injured 17 others. On December 14th, 2012, Adam Lanza entered Sandy Hook Elementary in Newton, Connecticut, and killed 26 people, mostly children. On June 18th, 2015, Dylan Roof killed 9 people at an historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina. On August 26th, 2018, just 6 weeks ago, David Katz opened fire during a Madden video game tournament in Jacksonville, Florida, leaving 2 people dead and 10 injured. So what is the one thing each of these persons has in common? Well, for starters, they're all around your age. They were all students, like you. They sat in class, like you sit in class. They took tests, like you take tests. They wrote their papers. They ate lunch in the common areas, just like you do. What else do they have in common? Well, it is this. They were all angry. They were each possessed by a demented and demonic anger. Demented because they were out of their mind, and demonic because what they desired was the death of other human beings. And as often happens in these instances of mass murder, friends and neighbors, like yourselves, are left asking impossible questions. Him? Really? How did we not see the signs? How did he get to this place of committing this kind of violence? Now, the diagnosis at one level is actually relatively simple. It's what psychologists call the progression from sad to mad to bad. You get hurt, as you do, and if the hurt is sufficiently painful, you get mad, and if your anger is left untreated, you do something bad. You do that by hurting others or by hurting yourself. In college at the University of Texas, I had what I felt was like a wolf inside of me. I walked around the University of Texas campus with an anger simmering just below the surface at all times. And any number of things might provoke me to an outburst. It could be a careless comment by a friend or a stranger. It could be a misunderstanding, a lost opportunity, the experience of failure or of neglect. And it was usually those closest to me, like family or close friends, that experienced my sudden eruptions of anger. After our daughter Blythe arrived in the world, I found myself driving around the streets of Durham, North Carolina, and like Liam Neeson from the Taken movies, I had this surplus of anger coiled up inside of me. I remember driving around and stopping at stop signs, and all cars around me were perceived as threats to my infant child's life, and therefore to my own well-being. I would sit at the traffic lights and imagine a scene played out where I would beat into unconsciousness an attacker with a baseball bat, a bat that I actually have never possessed, but such was my imagination. I was a pastor for 10 years. One time, I blew up in a staff meeting at a fellow pastor. I had nursed resentment against him for things I believed he had failed to do. And during one staff meeting at our church, he said something that touched a sore spot in me. And one moment I was listening, and the next moment I was yelling at him. I yelled at the top of my lungs, I shook my fists, my sight got blurry, and I felt an irresistible desire to harm him. It was ugly, and it was embarrassing. And I was in my mid to late 30s, and I should have known better. I now know, many years later, I am not the only one who struggles with anger. Plenty of things make people angry. It can be the state of the economy, the outcome of a sporting event, the experience of recurring sickness, the betrayal of a friend, the experience of domestic violence or the abuse of power by somebody in authority, the killing of innocent people. The trailer for the movie The First Purge that came out a few years ago has the character who is responsible for an experiment, a public experiment, to allow citizens to use violence in whatever way they wish for one night of the year. Say this: if we want to save our country, we must release all our anger in one night. A Time magazine article titled "The Las Vegas Shooting and Our Age of Anger" on October 4th, 2017 says this: Americans have made something of a fetish of our rage of late, a fact that's even been leaking into our language. The base is never just animated, it's always enraged. Healthcare debates are never spirited, they're always furious. In the run-up to the 2016 election, a CNN ORC poll found that 69% of Americans reported being either very or somewhat angry at the state of the nation. Bernie Sanders among them. But what Bernie Sanders actually said was this: I am angry, and millions of Americans are angry. So people get angry at themselves, they get angry at others. They get angry at themselves by saying things like, I'm so stupid, I'm fat, I'm ugly, I always fail, I always do that thing over and over again. Some people nag, others erupt in sudden fury, still others simmer in passive-aggressive behavior. It's also the fact that God gets angry. Jesus gets angry, and St. Paul says plenty of things about anger, not all of them self-evident. So what exactly are we to do with our experiences of anger or of those nearby us? How do we keep from losing our head when we feel used by people? How do we forgive someone who is unwilling to own up to their harmful actions? How do we stay sane when injustice keeps happening? What exactly are we to do with the boil of emotions that threaten to turn revenge fantasies into reality? More to the point of tonight's talk, can poetry, of all things, rescue us from our angry, violent impulses? I think the answer is a provisional yes. The Psalms, as a form of devotional poetry I would like to suggest to you this evening, enable us to feel angry without being undone by our anger. God gives us what might be called the curse psalms, or the imprecatory psalms, because you imprecate, you damn someone with them, so that we can be rescued from the desire to curse others in actions. So how then does God communicate good news through poetry is my first question. And my second question is, how might the imprecatory psalms, the curse psalms, the angry psalms become good news for you and me today? So let me take each question in turn. What is the good news of poetry? A basic presumption of the Psalms is that it is through poetry, not despite poetry or beyond poetry, that a faithful life is formed. But it begs the question, how does poetry do poetry? How does Hebrew poetry do its poetic thing? Let me point out just two features of Hebrew poetry. The first is this: that poetry is a kind of language that says more, and says it more intensely, more densely than does ordinary language. Let me give you an example. The sky above us. According to scientists, the atmosphere of Earth is composed of nitrogen, oxygen, argon with carbon dioxide and other gases in trace amounts. It has a mass of about 5.15 times 1,018 kilograms. You learned that here tonight. The principal layers of the atmosphere are the exosphere, remember this from science in 5th grade, the thermosphere, the mesosphere, the stratosphere, and the troposphere. Okay, that's what you're going to get from Wikipedia. Now, what does a poet say when he or she describes the sky above us? They say something like this: God's glory is on tour in the skies. Godcraft on exhibit across the horizon. Madame Day holds classes every morning. Professor Knight lectures each evening. Their words aren't heard, their voices aren't recorded, but their silence fills the earth. Unspoken truth is spoken everywhere, warming hearts to faith. That's how Psalm 19 in the Message by Eugene Peterson describes the sky in language that is more dense and more musical. In short, more poetical. Second observation about Hebrew poetry. It is that poetry brings us into metaphor-rich territory. A metaphor, as you learned in 5th or 8th grade or senior of high school or sometime at Berry College, is a figure of speech whereby we speak of one thing in terms of another. In Shakespeare, Juliet is the sun. The church is a temple, according to St. Paul, or God is our rock. In the Psalter, the truth does not exist on the other side of the metaphor, it exists through the metaphor. Take "The Lord is my shepherd," for example. Now, the Lord is, of course, not an actual shepherd by profession, like a Tunisian goat herd. Nor is the point simply to say that the Lord generically cares for his people. The metaphor of shepherd involves much more than that. In the context of Israel's life, the image of a shepherd was in fact not a gentle one. Shepherds were rough characters who at times became ruthless killers. The metaphor of shepherd evoked memories of Moses. It evoked associations with Israel's exodus. It evoked an image of wildernesses where sources of water were scarce and wild animals endangered the safety of sheep. It evoked non-cozy pictures of great kings as sovereign lords who treated the people as vassals. Evoking all these images, the metaphor of the Lord as shepherd involves what might be called a surplus of meaning. Yahweh shepherds his people with a fierce tenderness, as Martin Luther once put it, and much more so than that. So with the poetry of the Psalter, the good news comes to us, again, through the metaphor, not around the metaphor. So, two ideas about poetry in mind. How then might the imprecatory psalms as devotional poetry become good news for us today? Let me suggest 5 things to you tonight in brief. The first point is this. The Psalter opens with the language of God who judges the wicked, and it closes with language of the God who judges the wicked. So whatever else the imprecatory or cursed or angry psalms are on about, They're on about God. Psalm 1:6. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Psalm 147:6. The Lord lifts up the downtrodden. He casts the wicked to the ground. From the Psalter's perspective, it's not all about us, ultimately, you and me. It is not all about my experience of the wicked or your experience of the enemy. It is not about our need to punish and to give bad people what they deserve. Ultimately, it is about God. It is about the character of God. It is about the faithfulness and goodness and holiness and mercy of God, which is on judgment by us who are experiencing these experiences of violence. So it's important to be clear that all the vengeance language in the Psalms is not about personal vengeance. It's about God's justice. So what the psalmist longs for is God's vindication. So as hard as it is sometimes for us to resist the desire to get revenge, even in the most subtle, passive-aggressive ways, and to give people what they deserve who have done wrong to us, what the Psalms invite us to do is the exact opposite. They don't deny our anger at being wronged, but they do deny us the right to take vengeance in our own hands. It is in this sense, perhaps, that the Psalms of anger are essentially prayers of relinquishment. To pray this rhetoric of violence is to cede to God my desire to become violent. And so we pray, as the Lord taught us to pray, your will be done on earth in this circumstance as it is in heaven. We pray, I give you my pain. I relinquish to you my anger. That's the first point. The second, in the Psalms of anger, we encounter the ubiquitous presence of enemies. Enemies are everywhere in the Psalms. If we take the Psalms seriously then, rather than tidying them up, we have to reckon with the fact that enemies are real. We experience people as enemies, whether they are in fact enemies or not. The Psalter is awash in enemies. It is what the German scholar Erich Zenger explains in this way. He says, the people who pray the Psalms feel themselves surrounded, threatened, and shot at by a gigantic army, or they are like an animal pursued by hunters and trappers, or they see themselves surrounded and attacked by rapacious wild beasts, trampling bulls, or poisonous snakes. It is as if your mother, your father, your sibling, your relative, your friend, the president, the emperor, whoever they may be, is acting in these ways. It is important to stress, however, that praying against one's enemies in the Psalms within this context is not a matter of mere venting. It is a matter, rather, of honestly naming one's experience of enemies and of entrusting one's enemies to God. I'll say more about this at the end, but perhaps Psalm 139 may illustrate the paradigmatic pattern for prayers against enemies. So it is as if the Psalm is saying, pray against your enemy. Be my guest, but pray in this way. Do I not hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? Am I not grieved with those that rise up against thee? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies, and it is what we have said in the silence of our own conscience. But immediately following this imprecation, the silent then prays, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Now, the movement from one phrase, one statement, to another does not come easily, and it rarely happens in the moment. In fact, it often takes a great deal of time before you can move from verses 21 and 22 to 23 and 24. And sometimes it takes a great deal of prayer, or a great deal of years in the therapist's office, or whatever else it may take to move from one to the other. But that is, in fact, what the Psalms invite us to do, with God's help and the constant encouragement of friends. Point number 3. Where people are oppressed, the character of God is at stake. Psalm 139 again proves helpful. Surely thou wilt slay the wicked, O God, from the King James. Depart from me, therefore, ye bloody men, for they speak against thee wickedly, and thine enemies take thy name in vain. If violence is done against human creatures made in the image of God, then from the psalmist's perspective, that divine image is susceptible to defacement. If human community is ruptured by injustice, then the purposes of the divine communion are jeopardized. When the tribe slaughters the other tribe and nation wars against nation, then the God who made every tribe and nation needs to step in and save that which is his. If damage comes to creation, then the Creator's work is threatened. It is as if the psalmist were saying, this world is your idea, God. This human life is your duty, God. And if you don't do something to stop the wicked from destroying it all, it's your reputation that's at stake. Don't let it come to nothing. Don't let the suffering be meaningless. Deliver us for your name's sake, as Psalm 54 might put it. So when the psalmist experiences human injustice or a terror of nature, he feels acutely that the character of God is at stake. And this is, of course, what Christians have felt for centuries. If something bad or evil or tragic happens, you are always bumping it upstairs. Where is God? Who is God? Point number 4. The experience of violence inevitably provokes hyperbolic language as a way to express the shocking violation of the good order of God's world. Psalm 109 might be a good case study for us. It says this in the NRSV. May his days be few. May his children be orphans and his wife a widow. May his children wander about and beg. May they be driven out of the ruins they inhabit. May there be no one to do him a kindness, nor anyone to pity his orphan children. May his posterity be cut off. May his name be blotted out in the second generation, and may his memory be cut off from the earth. This is what's called cursing language. This certain enemy is being cursed. It's harsh, it's unnerving, and quite frankly, it is cruel. May his children wander about and beg. Let me suggest to you here a hypothesis that is a working idea that I hope is true, I think is true, that might make sense of this kind of language. The hyperbolic, outrageous, exaggerated, and perhaps even obscene language that we find in these imprecatory psalms occupies the same basic territory as profane language. Let me explain. There's an anthropologist named Mary Douglas, and she writes a book called Purity and Danger, and the summary is this. She says every society throughout history arranges itself around an orderly system that enables it to thrive. She calls this system of self-organization purity. Purity is a technical term, but it's fundamentally about what enhances life in that society, like justice and honesty and clean water and the making of hospitals. And it is also about what hinders life, injustice and deceit and unsanitary bathrooms and the making of sex slaves. Now, the opposite of purity in her book here is disorder. So there's purity on one side, order, and there's impurity or disorder or chaos on the other side. So while purity is related to order, it is also related to holiness, or I think in more better Bible terms, wholeness. So it holds things together, individuals and communities. The holy space is a space of life. To step outside of this holy space is to step into what might be called a profane space. Now, in Israel, let's take the example of the leper. The leper is excluded from holy spaces, inner spaces of temple area. Why? Because he represents an image, a physical image of physical disorderedness. Because his physical mispicturation, he belongs outside the temple. Now, it may seem cruel, but there is a reason for it, and Dr. Parker can explain all things to you in his classes on the Old Testament. But let me get to the point here. The word profane comes from the Latin, profanos, outside temple. So that's what profane language is doing. Profane space is the opposite of sacred space in technical terms, right? Profane language, analogously, can be thought of as language that lies outside of the boundaries of that which is good. Now, we say things like it's dirty language, right? Dirty words. Where did we get that? We get that from Mary Douglas. Not Mary Douglas, but from her study of how human societies work. That we use this language as a way of speaking about things that lie out here, right? So your mom and dad, somebody told you don't use dirty language. Now you understand anthropologically and theologically and biblically why. So the function of profane language is to facilitate a way to talk about uncommon, disordered, undesirable experiences. 2 examples. When the carpenter hammers his thumb, my carpenter screams, "Damn it." Why? Because hammering your thumb is not part of the good order of carpentry. So he expresses something that corresponds to what he experienced. During the Vietnam War, university students riot and protest. The National Guard fires tear gas into crowds of dissenters, and politicians dissemble. Both advocates and protesters of the war cry that it is an effed up war. Why do they use the F-bomb? Because they know that there's something fundamentally wrong about the whole thing, about how human beings are being treated. This, I think, is what underlies the cursing psalms. This is why we can describe them as obscene, profane, because it's language that's saying something about the way that human beings are living is just not right, and I got to find a way to say it, to name it. Please don't think this talk is permission for you to use profane, dirty curse words in your normal life. This is just all theory. Number 5. The imprecatory psalms point to a way out of slavery to revenge and to the freedom of forgiveness. And here I'm going to bring it a little bit more to home. Psalm 137. It is a famous psalm. It's the psalm that has the part about, I would love to dash the babies against the rocks. Right? It's the psalm that never makes it into our repertoires of prayer or worship or singing. Now, the first 2 parts of the song, the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept, they do make it into a register of artistic and liturgical and Christian interpretations, but not the 3rd section. But we're wrong to do it, I would like to suggest to you. We desperately need that part about the dashing of the babies against the rock, and let me explain why. The Croatian-born theologian Miroslav Volf insists that psalms such as these remain within our devotional practices and our worship practices. Why? Because they point a way out of slavery to revenge and into the freedom of forgiveness. Now, this is easier said than done, but Christian practices that are devoid of demanding language, like the kind we find in this psalm, leaves us vulnerable to theologies and pastoral practices that are incapable of dealing with the experience of anger that so easily, readily, and commonly lead to violence, with its systemic, multi-generational reverberations played out on the public scene and in the privacy of our own homes. So I'd like to suggest you should be reading Psalm 137, personally, publicly, at worship, and otherwise. Why? By placing unattended rage before God, Miroslav Volf says, we place both our unjust enemy and our own vengeful self face to face with a God who loves and does justice. He continues, hidden in the dark chambers of our hearts and nourished by the system of darkness, hate grows and seeks to infest everything with its hellish will to exclusion, the demonic part. In the light of the justice and love of God, however, hate recedes and the seed is planted for the miracle, because it truly is a work of God, of forgiveness. So where is our rage, our anger, variations on the theme of anger safe? He says this, it's not safe simply bottled up in my own heart. It's not safe in some public space of venting our collective feelings, as often happens in social media. It is safe only in the space where it is placed before the one God of both those whose children have been dashed against the rocks and of those who did the dashing of those children against the rocks. It's we all stand before the justice and mercy of God. All this being said, granted, it is never easy to know how to incorporate these imprecatory psalms into our practice of worship and prayer, but I think it's important to remember that the Holy Spirit, as the author of Scripture, has placed them there. Why? Because we are desperately in need of somehow naming these things before God and before others. Let me end. Aristotle, he said anyone can become angry. That is the easy part. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, in the right way, this is not easy. Which is short of what St. Paul says in Ephesians. Be ye angry, and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Be ye angry. Be angry. But don't sin in your anger. Or it is what Eugene Peterson says in the short film that I was able to do with him in Bonn. He said, what the Psalms offer us is a way to cuss without cussing. Right? So he's tapping into that profane language. So the difference between a right and a wrong response to anger, I suggest to you, is the difference between an honest heart and a hardened heart. An honest heart is honest to God about one's feelings. A hardened heart wants only to exact an eye for an eye, as the young men in my opening comments wished. An honest heart entrusts one's enemies to God, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And a hardened heart demonizes one's enemies. This is a very easy thing to do. An honest heart is angry before the face of God in the presence of the community. An honest heart is a known heart. It's a loved heart. It's a listened to and attended to. It is not a lonely heart. A hardened heart hides from God and perpetually finds the community wanting. So whether it is family troubles for you, or physical hardships, political turmoil, strife within your churches, or the failure of relationships, to pray these psalms of anger become, I believe, an occasion to speak before God and the people of God the very real, the very common angers of our hearts. And in doing so, we trust that Christ himself prays these same prayers in us and for us, and by his Spirit does something much better than managing our anger. He makes us holy. He frees us. He sets our hearts free to love God and our neighbors in a way that we never imagined or even dared to ask. And with that, I end, and I welcome any of your thoughts and questions. Thank you.